On the channel, we've talked about highways that should be removed, highways that have been removed, and today we're going to talk about highways that never actually happened. And we're going to look at different parts of the country and talk about how all of these communities that are very different all sort of came together with the same purpose and vision and mission in mind, and talk about these success stories of how highway projects were successfully defeated.
And to start off, we're going to start with the largest city in the United States, New York City, and the highway that was prevented from being built, the Lower Manhattan Expressway. And opposition to this expressway goes way back to the 1960s, to a name that, if you have been kind of paying attention to urbanism and cities and transportation, probably is going to be familiar to you, which is Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs is, for me, I know her from reading Life and Death of Great American Cities. There's also a great documentary called Citizen Jane that kind of talk about a lot of the different movements she was a part of and led over the years. But the Lower Manhattan Expressway was a big one of them very early on in her career.
And the idea of this Lower Manhattan Expressway actually started before the 60s with Robert Moses. Now, Robert Moses, we've named him as one of our top transit villains in the past. If you, again, know anything about transit history, you know Robert Moses was the guy who made highways happen. He was the guy who cleared the quote unquote slums. He had this master plan for multiple cities, but specifically New York, that had these crisscrossing highways all across Manhattan. And so part of his early vision was to build what they called LOMEX, the Lower Manhattan Expressway. He envisioned this as a 10-lane elevated highway cutting east-west across Lower Manhattan. It would have run from the Holland Tunnel on the west side to the Williamsburg and Manhattan Bridge on the east side. And the idea was to alleviate a lot of the cargo and freight traffic that was moving from New Jersey over to Brooklyn and Queens and sort of clogging up the streets in Lower Manhattan. His project, if it had happened, would have cut through Soho, Little Italy, and parts of Chinatown as well. And it was
You know
estimated it
what?
would have.
I think those neighborhoods would be better off with a 10-lane elevated highway through them. Just
Yeah,
more
nobody
lanes.
goes there. Those aren't big attractions in the city. Those aren't desirable areas to live.
Robert Moses was really right on this one.
Yeah, right. It's estimated it would have displaced over 1,900 families and closed 804 businesses. So the idea that this could have happened, and what the future, what today's New York would have looked like, would have been so vastly different than what we know New York as today.
Yeah, absolutely wild. And, fortunately, due to a large movement by all sorts of different folks, including Jane Jacobs, who I mentioned at the start here, prevented this from happening. So Jane Jacobs, who was a journalist turned activist, so she's, really good with words and understanding the politics of everything that was happening, reframed this issue of the highway being built through the neighborhood, kind of reframing it from being something that was progress versus obstruction into something that was more, livable streets versus sterile expressways. In Jacobs' writings, she talked a lot about, the importance of sidewalks and all of the different activities that would happen on the sidewalks, from cafes to a place for kids to play to, folks sitting out on their stoops talking to their neighbors, having cities that were designed in a way where folks would have their windows open on the street and you could kind of see the neighborhood going by and who was there and what was going on. And so much of what she was observing by just going around the streets as a journalist and then as an activist was so different from the vision that folks like Robert Moses was trying to paint with their, less than ideal designs for new apartment buildings and kind of getting rid of what Robert Moses and folks like him saw as slums. Like they described neighborhoods, that would have come down here in New York, but also neighborhoods in Boston, like the North End, as literal slums. And today, some of these neighborhoods are the nicest neighborhoods in these cities. So Jane Jacobs had it right at the time when she was, talking about this sort of stuff in her books. Other local leaders, such as Shirley Hayes, Verna Small, as well as all sorts of other folks, really formed a big coalition to protest these highways from being built.
Yeah, and this was not, an overnight fight. This is something that really lasted for just over a decade. It really started around 1962 when Jane Jacobs and several other allies that you just mentioned, they were successful in pressuring the city to withdraw funding for this project. By 1968, Robert Moses's sort of power over politics in this era was starting to wane. You had Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York, and you had Mayor John Lindsay. They began pulling away their support from more highway-centric planning and starting to look at the city, looking at the public transit in the city and looking at other viable options for moving people around. And so as the government started to pull funding and move away from highways, what did Robert Moses have to do? He didn't have neighborhoods to just demolish with pavement anymore. So his power started to wane. And then there were just repeated hearings. I mean, when we talk about the activism in this era, they were constantly at City Hall. They were constantly leading protests. And these repeated hearings that would be standing room only finally pressured city leaders to completely abandon this project. And by 1971, it was officially demapped from the plans for New York City. And, it's amazing to see the success of that, because when you look at other cities in the United States that get crisscrossed by highways, New York really doesn't in its core. New York, the core of the city is fairly highway free and is primarily surface streets, and it makes it a much more vibrant city for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important that these folks at the right time, while this was happening, got out there and got involved to make sure that this was never built. It would have been a permanent scar on New York City, and New York City is much better for the hard work that these folks put in at the time. The one thing, though, that we are missing out on, to add a little bit of lightness to it, is imagine the congestion pricing revenue from the traffic on that highway. Just imagine. The IBX would be built.
Lewis,
would be
there would be no need to have congestion pricing. There'd be no congestion. You would just have this
right.
10-lane
You built the
highway.
You added more
through.
lanes. Yes. Yeah. Had to get that in there.
One of my favorite stories from doing a little bit of research on this was in 1962 at a public hearing. Jane Jacobs, she led a group of parents and children through the neighborhoods in a mock funeral procession with big signs that said, "Here lies the village," that was really trying to drive the point home that this highway project would absolutely kill the little villages and neighborhoods and areas of New York that it would pass through. So a really good, a really good visual and impactful way to protest this. I love that story.
We're going to jump right back into this episode in just a second. But first, if you have not liked this video, go ahead and do so. Also, leave a comment. We love reading all of them and respond to as many as we can. And be sure that you are subscribed so that you catch every episode as they come out.
Please share this with your friends. And if you don't have time to watch YouTube videos in the future, you can catch us on any of the podcast platforms that are out there. Just be sure to leave us a rating and give us a comment.
All right, the next highway on our list is on the other side of the country, West Coast now, in Portland, Oregon. And this was the Mount Hood Freeway. And this one was ultimately prevented in 1974. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but it was a federal court setback that actually halted this one, as well as a 4-1 city council vote that ultimately killed the project. And in a very happy ending, a lot of the funding was actually put towards the light rail in Portland instead of towards this highway, which, man, I wish we were living in that timeline like today. Unfortunately, we're living in almost the exact opposite timeline in a lot of cases, I feel like. But this highway was conceived in the 1950s and 60s. It was going to be part of Portland's share of the interstate highway system. And it was going to cut through southeast Portland, heading into the city. And it ultimately, there wasn't a specific route that they had chosen. There were 3 different ones that all would have gone through working class neighborhoods and would have displaced over 1,700 homes, as well as dozens of businesses. I think it's important to note too, when we, in a lot of cases, throw out the number of homes being displaced, it is many more people being displaced than homes. I mean, 1,700 homes is already a ton, but you've got to figure that multiple people are living in each of these homes. So it would have affected tons of working class folks in southeastern Portland.
Yeah, and it was that displacement that really galvanized the community to start fighting back against this. Residents started organizing in the late 1960s. And there's a fun, not, again, I keep saying fun, but there's an interesting anecdote of neighborhood community groups that got together and they started mapping out what the highway department was showing them. And on a highway department's map, it just kind of showed this somewhat innocent, little thin line moving through the city saying, well, this is the proposed path that we would like the highway to take. The neighborhood started blowing up larger maps with the parcels and with the house outlines on it and started shading in every single property that would be demolished or taken over by the highway. And then the map became really clear. This is going to have a devastating impact on the community. They could actually, see these neighborhoods that they were already familiar with being bisected by this highway. And so that really is what galvanized the community, showing these maps and getting more people involved for them to really pick up the fight against this highway. With these community groups, there's also the Southeast Legal Defense Fund, which joined this fight. They claimed that this would destroy communities, increase pollution, and fail to solve traffic congestion. All arguments that we're going to hear are all common arguments we're going to hear from all of these different projects. But also it's important to think about this in the context of the era and what some people have dubbed the larger Freeway revolt. You were having very similar fights like this happening in San Francisco, Boston, and other cities. And this fight in Portland was actually inspired by the work of Jane Jacobs in New York. So that Lomax Expressway that was defeated had a direct impact on galvanizing community here and inspiring them to fight in this highway project.
Yeah, and I think even today there's some comparisons to be made with a lot of the highway widening projects. Some places are having more success than others, but I know we've talked about, I think on our second episode ever, we talked about the highway expansion in I-35. I honestly almost don't recommend you go watch it. I would be cringed going back watching it. But we've done further episodes talking about it as well. So just don't go back to episode number 2. Go to like 6 or 8, or we did another one later at some point. But groups in Austin like Rethink 35, obviously much more uphill battle being in Texas. Unfortunately, that project is under construction, but there are other, further north. I know Milwaukee is having some success in trying to, their DOT is kind of looking at options for different selections for construction. And right now, one of the proposals is actually, removing the highway in form of a boulevard, but one of them is adding to it. So, these groups are organizing across the country here. So it's worth mentioning that you should check out in your city or town or wherever you live to try to get involved with this sort of thing. I mentioned at the start of this section that lawsuits kind of helped end this one ultimately. And in 1972, this was the first successful attempt at preventing a highway from being built using the NEPA law, which is the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970. So today you're probably familiar with at least hearing the term NEPA. And unfortunately, instead of being used against highway projects now, it's usually used to prevent transit projects from happening or make them much more difficult to be, built.
One of the big turning points for the Mount Hood Freeway was in July 1974 at a Portland City Council meeting. It was here that hundreds of residents came in and crammed into the city hall. They brought photographs of their houses, photographs of their kids playing in front of the house. Somebody actually took a piece of a picket fence and was like, you're gonna really destroy everything in this neighborhood. It was a really intense, powerful movement by these neighborhoods coming together and trying to convince the city council that this project did not need to go forward. Eventually, the city council voted 4-1 to cancel the project. And after that, we had all of these funds, hundreds of thousands of dollars of funds that were still available. And the city and the state actually used that and applied it towards transit projects. That funded the Banfield Light Rail and started the Max Light Rail system which still exists today in Portland. All right, moving away from Portland, Oregon, we're actually going to head south. Like we said earlier, we're hitting different corners of the country, very different communities, but all of these communities shared something in common, and that is they had people who wanted to fight these projects. This time, we are going down to New Orleans, and we talk about New Orleans fairly often on the show, which is kind of funny given that it's not a big transit city, but I do love New Orleans. Um, but in this case, around the 1950s, there was a project that was proposed called the Vieux Expressway. And this would have basically connected I-10. There would have been a ramp through Elysian Fields, all the way down Elysian Fields to the riverfront. And then it would have cut along the riverfront, over the levee and the railroad tracks, through the French Quarter, into the Central Business District, all the way over to the Pontchartrain Expressway, and then connect back to sort of that highway that borders that side of downtown New Orleans. As you can imagine, there were a lot of people that were really upset about the idea of this project cutting through historic neighborhoods through Marigny, and then also then cutting through the French Quarter, which is wild to think about a highway cutting through the French Quarter today. When you consider the cultural and the heritage that exists there. It's wild that this was ever really proposed.
Yeah, and even just like separating parts of the city like the French Quarter from the waterfront area this would have been a 6 lane elevated highway is wild. And in the United States there were plenty of highways built along the water, as we've talked about in some of the previous highway episodes we've done. We spoke specifically at one point about the Embarcadero in San Francisco, and how much better that waterfront area is today. I know Seattle also just buried their waterfront highway, so nice to see that New Orleans was able to prevent this from happening before the destruction was already really done.
Yeah, and this would have really cut off the French Quarter from the riverfront, which in a historical context, the French Quarter was where New Orleans was founded. It was the original part of the city. It was the highest ground in the swamp. Like this is the historical and cultural center of New Orleans, French Louisiana, Louisiana the state, this whole entire region. So the idea of cutting off that tie from the riverfront just seems like a crime to me. But you can already, if you go to this area, you can already see where the highway would have cut through. There is a gap between the French Quarter and the river that exists. There's a levee system that prevents the Mississippi from continuing to flood into New Orleans. And there's a railroad track that is there. Now it gets used as a streetcar track, and then there's some other freight traffic that moves through. But what fighting this project allowed was for that space to then become a park. And so there's this nice sort of promenade that connects back to the French Quarter that you can go and explore today.
You can actually see that park in our New Orleans using only public transit episode. We ended our episode sitting on the wall, like right along the river. It was like a really beautiful evening. I remember it was like I was not feeling well that day, so I was pretty tired during doing the wrap up there. But I remember
it was all the beignets.
We got the beignets really carried me through the afternoon. That was the pick me up that I needed. Interestingly, this was another example though of NEPA being used ultimately to help stop the project, as well as the French Quarter being designated a National Historic Landmark District, as it should be. Clearly, it's one of the most unique places in the United States, actually. There's not anywhere else that really looks like it. Although maybe you'll correct me, being from Mobile, if there are parts of Mobile that feel that way. I don't know, but
not quite the same. It's definitely the most unique. So for all the reasons that Lewis just mentioned, this project seemed like it was pretty doomed from the start. By 1970, the U.S. Department of Transportation cut all funding for this highway, and then the effort to build it really collapsed from there. Some anecdotal stories of this time. There was a really famous moment that came about when preservationists circulated these postcards, and the postcards showed what the French Quarter would look like with this giant highway cutting it off from the French Quarter from the river. And these postcards, made a national splash. There was outrage from all over the country, not just in New Orleans. So again, it was a very powerful visual form of protest that people were able to use and use in a great way to fight this project. And then another story is that they leveraged Mardi Gras. So I really love this. Mardi Gras also can be very political. There are usually organizations that will take whatever is happening in the current political climate, and they will theme their parade after it. Or like in Mobile, there's a whole group called the Comic Cowboys that their floats are actually, every single float is something that's in the news currently. New Orleans did this with this highway. They had Mardi Gras parade floats themed after this giant monstrosity that was supposed to come through and destroy the French Quarter. And that had a really powerful impact on the people in New Orleans, people who were visiting New Orleans, and really helped ultimately to sway people's minds in the project.
Absolutely. And if you're in New Orleans or just interested in highways in New Orleans, in our 7 highways that should be removed episode, we also featured a different highway in the city. So definitely worth checking that out. And then in that episode, we give some information on different groups you can get involved with if you want to help out or learn more about what's going on there. So the last city on our list is our first time going north of the border up to Canada. Number 4, Toronto, Ontario. This one, though, is going to be just exclusive to folks on Patreon. So if you want to hear the 4th one, you can go ahead on over to Patreon and check that out. It is the best way to support the show.
And it should be noted, it was around this time period, you'll notice all these stories, they all really took place in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. And it should be noted that this was a really huge moment in history, not just in the United States, in Canada and around the world, but you had a lot of movements like this that were happening, that were getting people involved, and you saw direct political action from these really community-focused grassroots movements. And so started to look at, well, why were these movements successful in this area? Again, we're talking about different quadrants of the continent, all very different communities, very different cities. How did they all have these successes? And it really comes down to what was happening in this era. This was the era of civil rights and community power. A lot of the highways that had come through had targeted Black, brown, and immigrant communities. And so these communities, which were already fired up and fighting for civil rights, saw the highway as something that just destroyed their communities. And it did. It absolutely destroyed their communities. And so they were able to continue that civil rights movement, that fight, into challenging what really hadn't been questioned before. And that was where we built these highways and these infrastructure projects.
Totally. And yeah, we didn't really talk much about that in this episode up to this point, but so many, we did mention it in the previous episodes on this topic, but so many of these were, straight through Black and brown neighborhoods to poor neighborhoods. It very conveniently is like, oh, well, this is where the route should go. And it was like conveniently avoiding the wealthier suburbs and neighborhoods in the area. So, I'm glad you brought that up. The other major thing that's really happening at this time is the environmental movement. This is Silver Spring. I can't.
The book Silent Spring.
Silver Spring. I just have PTSD from saying Silver Springs over and over again. The book Silent Spring comes out in 1962, which spurs all sorts of interest in the environmental movement. Earth Day becomes a thing. NEPA, as we mentioned, comes into play here and reframes highways as polluters kind of for the first time. So there was now a legal argument to be had that these things shouldn't be happening. So that was another major element to this.
Yeah, historic preservation was also on the rise. We started seeing national historic landmarks being designated all across the country. And today, you can't really go to a downtown without seeing a smattering of buildings that are historically preserved. They were using this historic preservation movement as well to protect these neighborhoods. And then there was also just a big rise in counterculturalism and youth activism. A lot of this came around challenging the government around the wars that were happening and everything else that was sort of changing and going on in society. So yeah, a lot of movement there too.
Totally. And lastly is just politics in general. The political attitudes on these sorts of things began to change once they realized how many people this would affect. And a lot of the kind of base of middle-class homeowners began to really join that opposition. So you ended up with some power in numbers and politicians doing what they do, playing the game to win more votes, seeing that, hey, maybe there is a lane for me to represent these folks and come out in opposition to these projects. So yeah, definitely an interesting topic. And we've talked about all different forms of highways that should be removed, highways that were built and then were removed, and now here kind of visiting just a few here of highways that were prevented from being built. This list could be much longer. In fact, even the list in front of us is much longer, but we needed to boil this down to a couple for the episode. Maybe we'll revisit some others in the future. So if you have any good examples that you'd like us to take a further dive into, definitely let us know down in the comments.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in total I had 8, and I was like, oh, this episode can't be 2 hours long. So
yes, yeah. With all that being said, yeah, definitely let us know what you think of this episode. If there's another angle to highways that we could cover, again, I just laid out the 3 that we've done so far, but if there's another 4th dimension that we're missing, definitely call it out for us. If you want to support the show directly, the best ways to do so are via our Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or the merch store linked down below. If you haven't liked this video or subscribed, please consider doing so, especially if you made it this far. But without further ado, thank you all so much for watching, and enjoy the rest of your
Transit Tangents Tuesday.
Yeah, I'm saving that dough. Public transit's where it's at. Watch me go.